Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Thank you for joining today's webinar hosted by the Sikh Research Institute. This webinar will begin with a 50-minute moderated discussion between our presenters, after which we will have 40 minutes for Q&A from the audience. So please drop your questions in the chat box and be sure to include your name and city. Now, I would like to introduce you to today's panelists. We have Harinder Singh. Harinder Singh is an educator and thinker who is deeply in love with One Force, the oneness that radiates in all. He currently serves as a senior fellow, research and policy at the Sikh Research Institute. His current focus is on availing the message of the Guru Granth Sahib to global populations and developing critical thinking in Sikh institutions. He currently resides in the United States with his wife and 2 children. And we also have Jasleen Kaur. Jasleen is a double UVA grad in religious studies, focusing on South Asian religions through the lens of literature and poetry. She is currently working as a researcher with Sikhi. She also loves singing in her free time, whether on stage, with her friends, or alone in her kitchen. She hopes to eventually go back to school in pursuit of a PhD in either religious ethnography or history and fulfill her dream of teaching and learning from others. Please welcome today's panelists. Lovely. Yeah, so I will be moderating this conversation. Just to let everyone know, the crux of this conversation will be to understand sexuality in the context of a Sikh worldview. However, please keep in mind that we are not simply here to read the report or the information in the State of the Panth report. It has been linked in the chat box, so please feel free to have a read after today's webinar. As a fairly new addition to the Sikhi team, I was so excited when I first joined to see this report being put together. And I'm equally as thrilled now to be able to engage with Harinder Singh and Jasleen in this conversation. I think sexuality in general is confusing and usually an avoided topic. So yeah, and then when we try to have a conversation about it in the Sikh context, it's difficult to find spaces where such a conversation is happening. So I'm grateful for the space that has been provided. Before we get into what Bani, history, or lived Sikhi says about sexuality, I'll throw my first question to Jasleen. You drafted this report. I'd love to start with some insight into why sexuality was the theme or the focus of this report and what was being discussed through this drafting process.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I wanted to throw in a couple of like personal sort of like anecdotes. As I've been a researcher at Sikhi, I think a conversation that comes up quite a bit is what does Sikhi say about sexuality? Especially when I was doing the teen course, that was a big topic of conversation, and something that I think Harinder Singh and I have both found in a lot of ways when it comes to sexuality. People will like kind of ask you in like hushed tones, or they'll look for like very clear moral pronouncements, or they'll be given moral pronouncements in the case of the teenagers, where it's like they thought the Sikh understanding of like sexuality was just you can't have sex before marriage, like that's it. So there's no sort of like nuancing or like complete understandings of how words like Kam are used in the Guru Granth Sahib, how like the metaphor of union with Ikongar is often, the metaphor of like going to the divine's bed or like union with the divine is common. And so I think like it's a thing that we were thinking about over like a long time, like maybe years, because of what we were finding both in like the teen spaces and the young adult and like older spaces as well. I think like even within our closed circles, we're like uncomfortable bringing these things up because we don't want that judgment. We're afraid to ask certain questions. And so, you know, sexuality is a thing that's a part of all of our lives, no matter what. So I think that's why we really felt the need to address it. As far as drafting the report, I think Yeah, we were kind of just thinking through the questions that we've been asked. So a big thing in the teen class was like, what is scam? Like, what does that even mean? What is lust? What is, like, is it the same as sex? Are they synonymous? Is there a difference? What is love? How is love explained in Gurbani? And then also there's questions about sexual orientation that come up too. So like sexual preference, sexual orientation, where do we fall on that? Is there a clear moral pronouncement? And that came up again with the teens. so I think those major questions kind of sort of centered us in some kind of trajectory of like how we were going to read through these things, how we were going to think through these things, what nuances we felt we needed to add. And yeah, so the purpose of the report that we kind of came up with in discussion was like, we want to understand sexuality in the context of a Sikh worldview. And we want to understand how like Sikhi shapes our human behavior when it comes to that. But also like, how does the way that we view this integral part of like our experiences as humans, how do we view that in connection to like how we sort of conceive of relationships, morality, spirituality, and like whether or not we should be placing judgments on people. These are all things that are connected to this topic. So those were things that we kind of thought through. And then the first, I think, major thing we had to do was define what sexuality was in the context of the report. So we were very clear, and we said it encompasses both how one experiences sexual and romantic attraction, if at all, because some people don't. And then two, one's interest in and preferences around sexual and romantic relationships and behavior. So I literally just read that off of the report because I think that is really important to get very clear right off the bat. But yeah, so those are the things that we thought through and the reasons behind feeling that it was important for us to write on this topic. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's one of the elements of the discovery class that I loved so much, that these conversations are happening, and it's so wonderful to have a space where context is provided. And I think that's both what you did in that class and what is being done in this report. So maybe moving into more on what is written in the report, and touching on some things that you've already brought up. Yeah, so some conversations in the mainstream in relation to sexuality, in relation to sexuality, revolve around, like you said, love and lust, which I think relates to what is sex an expression of. Is it for procreation? Can it be for pleasure? So I'll throw it back to you again, Jasleen. In the context of Bani, what is love? What is lust? And why are the two so often connected or linked?
So I think the first thing that we have to make clear is that like Bani is not a thing that will give us moral pronouncements. We're not people of the law. So if anything, and kind of what our goal was with the report, Bani gives us a sense of how to think through things together, how to develop personal relationships with these ideas and with Ikonkar in a way that affects how we behave in the world. So that's an important thing, I think, to make clear before I get into it. But so the way that Bani talks about lust, we had to clarify that Gam in the context of Bani is not just about sexual lust or like indulgence in a sexual sense. It's also about indulgence in just the material world, being governed by your sort of fleeting temporary emotions. Yeah, looking for indulgence in whatever way that exists. It doesn't only have to be in a sexual context. So that's another important thing, because a lot of times within like the translations of that word within the context of Bani, we have phrases like love of fornication, or in the case of the teens, a lot of them understood Gam as sex before marriage specifically. So it's important to kind of contextualize that term before we can really understand what lust in the context of like a sexual like relationship or interaction means or looks like. So yeah, I mean, I think generally within Bani, like the the classification of lust is that it's a thing that generates negativity or distraction. It's fleeting. It's centered in indulgence and attachment. And it might make you feel good for a second, but in the long run, it does frustrate you, and it does, it causes pain. You know, within the report, we also like talked about what it takes to get that kind of under control, because you can't get rid of it because you're a human. But what does it take to recenter yourself in Nam? Because that's really what lust distracts you from. So if you can't identify with Ikonkar in your day-to-day life because you're so busy kind of chasing these fleeting temporary pleasures, you're going to end up feeling a lot of pain. And then removing yourself from that in a way, kind of getting it under control, is also a painful process. So I would say that that's like the general understanding of lust. And then in the context of like sexual relationships, I think it's, you know, it's pretty much, it's similar. It's about things being rooted in passion and indulgence, and kind of going with your sort of baseline, I guess, instincts to feel pleasure. And then when it comes to love, I think they're contrasted. So love is not temporary. Love is this deeply sort of committed thing that doesn't involve transaction or scorekeeping or any of those kinds of things that we do actually fall into within our relationships, where we might think like, this is a love relationship, I'm in love with my spouse, right? Like, I'm in this context, there's no way that I can possibly be lustful or rooted in the temporary. And that's just not true, because within our relationships, with our spouses or in our committed relationships, we can fall into that way of thinking quite easily. So I think that was an important thing to think about too, because if we are just thinking about lust as being something that happens outside of the context of marriage, and love as just being something that happens within the context of marriage, then we're not really understanding the full picture. And one thing that I know that I've gone on and on, but one thing that I did want to point out is like that metaphor that I talked about like union with Ikonkar, like being used within the context of that metaphor of, you know, a sexual moment of union or a sexual union, which I know is controversial and makes people uncomfortable, but there's, you know, there's an example within the context of Bani that says, you know, in Kuchaji, right? Guru Nanak Sahib says, you know, I'm the Kuchaji, and at the very end, he's like, okay, all you Sahagans, all you like fortunate brides, all you people who are connected with Ikonkar, how do I get there? And then in that voice, the Kuchaji says to Ikonkar, just give me one night. Give me one night of union. That's like pretty explicitly, like that metaphor is very clear. It's not one night, you know, of hanging out, you know, like it's a very clear metaphor. And I think maybe that makes us uncomfortable because we like to have those clear moral pronouncements. There's definitely a history of that in the kind of, in religiosity in general. It's either like abstinence or, you know, more tantric kind of like overindulgence. But yeah, I think that it's really important to look at how that metaphor is used again and again in Gurbani. And we also had an example that we included where it says, you know, I have had one night without my spouse, and my body is like breaking down because I've had one night where I haven't felt that union. So again, these metaphors are there, and I think it's important to understand those in the context of these terms. Yeah.
Thank you. And you're not going on and on. I think everyone appreciates the elaboration. Harinder Singh, thank you to you as well for joining us today. I will throw this next question at you. So now that we've kind of gotten a little bit of context into love, lust, and we did touch a little on marriage, let's delve maybe right into what Bani says about marriage and same-sex marriage, because I know that will come up. Previous State of the Panth report was released specifically on marriage in Sikhi and Ankaraj, which has been linked in the chat box as well. And I know Jasleen briefly touched upon it, that an argument can be made and has been made that Bani specifically invokes a husband and wife. So further saying, what can be said about both marriage and same-sex marriage in Bani, and what this metaphor, under literal and metaphorical understandings of this metaphor or of these terms.
Yeah, go for it, everyone. So Manvinder, I'm going to start with where Jasleen started to carry this forward to this level, because anytime when we want to discuss something which has much more discontent within the community, we got to keep our principles in mind. And we know this, we must acknowledge that there are serious disagreements on this issue, just like globally there are, within the Sikh community there are as well. So first thing I want to mention is that the report is, as Jasleen mentioned, is looking at what the teenagers or people below the age of 25 were discussing and wanted to know more about. At the same time, it's looking at what as a community have we learned about this in our collective literatures, banis, histories, as well as taking opinions of people today. So the reason I'm mentioning that is when you look up in English an article related to sexuality and Sikhi, you just find Sardar Kapoor Singh's. I, in fact, even remember when I introduced that to teach at Siddak, there was a lot of discomfort in the facilitators because we are just not used to as a culture to talk about something which is reduced to an act of sex, but in Gurbani is also something personal and something very intimate. So there is a larger discomfort with this issue, but gurus have figured out and had figured out a vocabulary and a way to talk about things which are very real emotions and how to talk about them in a way which are not divisive, which are not unhealthy, which are not explicit or vulgar, but something which builds us, builds our relationships. So the report is also getting into those elements as well. How does the Panth think about this? How do the communities who are all over the diaspora are going to think about it? So with that, we walk into the marriage aspect. So marriage, the oft quoted line, which all of you know, is that, ek jyot doi murti, which essentially is about that there is one light and two bodies. Now, interestingly, what I would like to share here is that almost all of the Sikh world, if not the whole Sikh world, which does interpretations of Gurbani, actually believes that this is metaphoric, including the Lama, including everything we are invoking. So when we interpret this and the rest of the Bani, we say this really is about the larger union with the divine, with the Koankar, what Jasleen was referring to. But when we interpret this for actual, what we now call marriages in a social sense, in a public sense, obviously it's a personal act. But when we interpret it for the marriage, in this life on this earth, we end up reducing that this is actually only about a man and a woman. But in every other situation, when the terms tan or pair or sohagan or dohagan come, there is no disagreement that they're referring to the beings, the human beings. So I think this is something we all need to reconsider a little bit, that let's not be so hush-hush that this is not gendered in Gurbani. It is definitely metaphorical. So why do we make this exception when we interpret it? And we need to reconsider that. Second thing we need to also understand is that we meaning most world societies started, and also the Punjabi Sikhs, which are the 80% of the population even now in Punjab, we come from agrarian societies where there are conservative cultures. And when we come from those cultures, if we don't keep our principles in mind, we will end up making pronouncements which are more in line with the law of the land or the cultural practice of the land rather than what Gurbani is saying or what your value system is saying. So when we look at from a Bani's angle, the marriage is very clear. It is really about we are recreating the union in our lives on this earth between beings, between two individuals, classically and traditionally man and a woman. But Gurbani doesn't say that. It uses those words. And we understand this is how it was in the Guru period. And we understand this is how it is even in the current Rahit, and we can get into it. But what we do also need to understand is that marriage is traditionally what they were accepted from day one and how that evolution has been taking place as well. So for example, at the Guru period, there is acknowledgement that there are people who are not cisgender. We talk about Shah Hussein's example is available. In fact, he submitted his Shabas, and we discussed this on the report a bit. And Mahakavi Santokh Singh invokes it that Guru Arjan Sahib basically called him a great guy. And he wanted him to continue with what he was doing, whereas he actually critiqued the works of others. So this was not a pronouncement on his writings or on his individualism. It was really actually saying that this guy makes a lot of sense, how we would say it today. So the marriage as it was being evolving, the caste issues, we are still not evolved fully 550 years later, but it is something which we have been dealing with. Race issues have entered in last 20, 30 years, as we have become more global community. But actually, I would say us marrying interfaith marriages or interracial marriages, or in American realities, Punjabi Sikhs marrying Mexican farm workers before the 1950s and 60s, when you were allowed to bring your spouses. So we have gone through those evolutions, and now the world is talking about it, about homosexual marriages or relationships based on LGBTQIA plus communities. We need to understand that everything takes time, and this is a conversation we must be having, because there are Sikhs who are going through this pains. We also need to understand it takes time and patience and diligence to figure out how to navigate through these things. But one thing is very clear: it is all about human beings developing a very intimate and personal relationship as a purpose to connect with the divine, even in the unions on this earth. And traditionally, yes, those unions were, and they continue to be in the codifications between a man and a woman in a classical sense. But we must be open to and understand and empathize and figure out how to deal with this when people don't want to follow those traditional relationships.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, kind of building off of that, I think. So this conversation we've had about love and lust, and then marriage, talking about same-sex marriage, I think something, or marriage that veers away from heterosexual norms. I think this obviously comes with a lot of judgment from the community if you don't adhere to traditional, whatever that might mean, norms. So there is a theme in the report around writings on grace. So particularly, there's a section discussing mentions in Bani of the courtesan Ganaka, who got freedom through connecting to Nam. It's in the report, it says, no matter society's judgments of one's action, one can always be freed through connecting with Nam or identifying with Ekongar. Bani tells us that those who live in Nam culture are uplifted, regardless of what society might say. And later, even if an action is deemed unacceptable by society, grace pervades if one enters Nam's culture. So Jasleen, I'll direct this question to you. Maybe you could elaborate on this question of grace and this connection that's being made to external judgments that is the lived reality of members of our communities. External judgments that are made of people's sexualities.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So the line says, Ajamal Gaj Ganaka Patat Karam Kine Tyo Uttar Par Pare Ram Nam Line. So a rough translation of that, I think a pretty good translation of that, is Ajamal, elephant, and Ganaka committed degrading acts. They landed on the shore by crossing dreadful world ocean, by remembering one charmer identification. So I'll explain that. Something that we explain in the report in the context of like the couple of excerpts where Ganaka is referred to, it has to do with this idea of grace, because when we talk about like external judgments that are put on people, a sex worker is like a prime example of that, right? Like how do we as society think of that work? How do we as society think of people who engage in that work? And it's worth noting that even now, in many contexts, that's a lot of times some of the only work people who are queer or on the periphery can engage in. So even in Baikur Das's Var, like there's no, he references prostitution or sex work, as we would say now. And there's no like question about whether or not those who engage in sex work are like guilty of something, or whether there's a moral judgment that needs to be put on them. There's actually a question of like who deserves blame, who's taking advantage of people in this transactional way, who's using courtesans for their entertainment. And it's a lot of time, it's powerful men, right? So we felt like those verses and like that context was very important, because we can take that further out and look at the question of grace and look at the question of moral judgment. Something that I found interesting, because I want to take it to like what we started to see with when the survey first went out, is a lot of people were upset that the survey even existed. There was a lot of like feedback that said, you know, this is a private matter. Why are we discussing this in public? You should leave this up to people to deal with on their own. And it's interesting to me that when it comes to certain people, we feel very comfortable taking our moral judgments and our discussions on sexuality and the morals of certain people's lives very much into the public sphere. So when we talk about queerness, when we talk about like people who are not cisgender, like the way that we talk about them and their sexuality and all the things that it encompasses, we feel very comfortable making those judgments. So I think it's important to remember that we're not centered in this idea of like karma, where like you do something and we're going to judge you for it. And we believe that because of what you've done or because of the life you live and the moral judgments that we have decided to place on you, you don't get union, you don't get salvation in whatever way we think that is. But I think it's really important to remember that grace is always there. Grace can always be accessed through Nam. And the reason, I mean, I can't speak for the gurus, but I think the reason that we included in the report is because we want to emphasize, just as they emphasized, that revolutionary idea that no matter what anybody judges you on, no matter what they say about you or how they classify your life, you can always access grace. You can always cross the world ocean with Nam. And that relates to one of the takeaways that we had, which is that your Sikhi journey cannot come under external judgment. Your Sikhi journey is personal. This is about like cultivating a personal relationship with Ikonkar and a personal understanding of that relationship, and watching that transform your understanding of your own sexuality and your own lived experience. So again, I think that idea of grace and the understanding that moral judgment, external moral judgment from like human to human has no place in this is one that it's a point I really want to bring home and like hammer in. I think it's important for us to remember in a lot of contexts, not just in the context of sexuality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's a powerful and a helpful inclusion. And it's not something that I would have expected to see when I think about what will I read when I read a report on Sikhi and sexuality. So I think that and other inclusions was something that I appreciated about this report, that it touched on, this idea of prostitution. And then there was also a section on polygamy. So things that wouldn't be at the forefront of my brain when I'm thinking about what goes into a report on Sikhi and sexuality. But in regards to the polygamy section, there is a quote by Gurdas, and it says in the report, it says it is clear one is to have only one partner, as this is a wise choice and responsible social behavior. And then this quote is followed, rightly so, by discussion of the lives of the gurus, some of whom it was believed or claimed to have had multiple wives. So Harinder Singh, I'll direct this question to you. Maybe elaborate a little more on the discussion around polygamy that happens in the report, and what is the Sikh understanding of polygamy, and how does it relate to the gurus' lives?
Sure. I want to also mention that when Jasleen was talking about Ganika's example as somebody who was a prostitute or a sex worker, at the same time, there's also a mentioning of Ajamal in there, which is that there are people who have done things which, legally or ethically, morally will be considered wrong, and then how they can also overcome their own violations in order to access grace as well. So we are not people of condemnation at any level. We are people of personal relationship and accountability so we can access grace for anyone. Similarly, when I earlier was talking, it was about same sex, I want to mention the same thing here. We don't have any condemnation, so we really need to watch out, Sikhs, those who are practicing those things. You can have disagreements. But one thing is very important on the same-sex marriages. When you ask me, I want to just reiterate here, is that it is not a deviant behavior according to Gurbani, and you can read up on sciences which are even more clear on it. So making it that somehow they are being more lustful when they are not practicing a traditional marriage, those arguments don't hold any water because many traditional marriages are lustful as well, and there are rapes in them as well. So those arguments have no basis. We need to be a little bit more careful when we are making those conclusions or pronouncements. So similarly, it applies to this idea of gurus' lives. So what we know, we have shared, and there are enough historical examples or citations available, and we chose to go with Paikan Singh Nabas. It is uncomfortable area. It is an area where we don't know enough. So we shared what we know because this is one of the sources cited who has studied these things. And there are various answers given on this matter. I've given those and many other people have. But the point is, what does it actually tell us? Firstly, about the lives of the gurus. Look, I think we can share a few things. One is that when we are saying polygamy here, in traditional sort of a culture, when the gurus were also operating, men can have multiple wives was, although it was not a norm, but it wasn't an anomaly. Even 100 years ago, this was not an anomaly. So we have to understand the context of that. Second is, and this is already assuming that we don't know enough historically. So we just listed what we do know, and they're inconclusive. So we must understand it's inconclusive, but we must acknowledge what we know. The other things are, we talked about their customs around these things, which had consequences. And we gave examples of Guru Har Gobind Sahib, when he had rejected and what happened with the Chandu. And there are other explanations given that in some cases, marriage is not in a conjugal sense. But what we do know is, at the end of the day, which is what you invoked, Manvinder, that what Bhai Gurdas ji is writing becomes the basis of what a norm is. What becomes essentially at some point becomes the code among the Sikhs. Because as the community is developing, as cultural norms are playing a role in defining who we are, we have principles which are also defining these things. So not acknowledging the guru's wives is problematic, and it is not historically possibly accurate, and it actually diminishes from the status of the Matajis, the wives of the gurus. At the same time, we need to also understand that codifications get developed much later. And we also know there are problems of historical revisions here. So I'm going to leave it at that. Now, let's apply what we do know about marriage and about gurus and polygamy to what we are dealing with. So today, we do have a very clear codification of that in the Rahit. There is one, it's a one spouse, and in a traditional sense, one wife, one husband. But we also know at the same time that there is no such pronouncements when it comes to what is a definite no-no. So yes, there are laws of the land we have to consider. There are cultural norms we have to consider. And there's a societal recommendation which is eventually becoming part of the codes. And we need to understand that the Rahats and the codes and the Rahatnamas are reflections of the evolutions of the time into what the current societies are. So that's what we are seeing. So I want to just end this with this particular point that we don't have conclusive answers on this. What we do have is understandings developed to date on it, which start with this idea of becoming a coherent unit to experience the divine. And whatever you are practicing on this earth, it's a microcosm of becoming, having a union with Ikonkar or Vaheguru or Force, whatever you want to call it. So we are not like RLDS or FLDS or certain Islamic laws or certain other cultural societies where they are endorsed by the religious practices. What Sikhs are dealing with in a very small percentage of this, in sometimes overly intellectual conversation on this is not really an issue for us. But even at the same time, we do not get into moral judgments where people do that because we don't fully understand where they're coming from. So that's an acknowledgement within the report that we have a recommendation is so clear, the current Rahit is so clear, everything else is not clear, but we are developing an understanding for that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, yes, the context and is what I appreciate about this report. I don't think the goal of this report was to make any moral pronouncements. So I think, it's helpful in having or getting a conversation started, or just a source to turn to when individuals in the community are engaging in this conversation. And similarly, in this non-judgmental frame of conversation that we're having, one of my favorite parts of the report was the harmony within section, where it talks about the ultimate goal for each individual in regards to the sexuality is to find harmony within. Kind of along the lines of the conversation that we've already been having. It says, Guru Nanak Sahib says, female is in the male and male in the female. Understand this, O divine realized being. It is up to each individual to look into themselves and ask if the socially constructed and internalized binary of male and female harmonizes with the real purpose. So I know that that's like quite a wordy chunk. So the constructed and internalized binary of male and female. Jasleen, I'm going to throw this question to you. If you could elaborate a little more on this, and perhaps, maybe afterwards. Actually, I'll just leave it at that. Maybe if you want to elaborate a little more on what social construction is and this internalized binary and how it's acknowledged in the report.
Yeah, thank you. So the line is Purik mein nar, nar mein purka, pujo param gyani. So yes, so that was the translation you had read, is what we kept in the report. And we were thinking about this in terms of like a larger point that it's making about binaries, right? So a theme that we see throughout Gurbani is like we have to do that hard work of addressing like sort of dualities and dichotomies and binaries and the ways that we other ourselves and kind of categorize people. Like that's a thing that we constantly have to do the work to kind of unlearn. And we know from like current like academia that like gender is a construct. So I think, but I don't think that this is just a point about gender. So the way that we've explained it in the report is like, okay, the female is in the male because, right, the male is necessary for producing like the female through sperm, right? Sperm's needed to fertilize an egg. The male is in the female because the female is the vessel that holds and nurtures and grows the human, right? So these things are sort of, there's like a play happening there, I think, if I can say that. And that's not, in my opinion, not just a statement about like gender binaries. I think it's a larger statement that's being made about that unnarratable narrative, that thing that we have to understand that's really difficult to understand because of the way that we live as humans in the world, people of categories and people of these constructs. So I think like that larger statement about trying to understand that unnarratable narrative, trying to understand and unlearn the binaries so that we can move towards an understanding of oneness, of ekonkar, right? Like that's our work. And I think if I can take this into things that I've noticed in certain discussions amongst like people my age, and I know the whole report isn't about like same-sex and uncourage, but an argument that I saw a lot of times was about that metaphor that Harinder Singh spoke about, and taking that metaphor as proof that that is the only acceptable version of a relationship between two people is between a husband and a wife, instead of taking it as, well, this is the most commonly understood context in which to make this point. And when it comes to that and looking at Rahit and understanding the spirit of Bani while you're trying to understand codes of conduct, I think if we're concerning ourselves with and focusing in on gender, which is a construct, which is something that is addressed in this excerpt, if we're focusing in on that, I think that we're losing sight of that oneness. And I think we're falling for that binary in a way that doesn't honor the spirit of Gurbani. So maybe that's a controversial thing to say, but that's how I would understand this in the context of both the report and also the context of like larger discussions we're having currently, you know, on Sikh Twitter and all that. But yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I think there was just a little bit of feedback on my end. I am mindful that we are almost at the end of our conversation, and I would like to remind everyone to send their questions, which I see they are. And if you do see your questions disappearing, it is only because I'm pushing them to the Q&A box so I can keep them all in order for myself. So as we maybe wrap our conversation up, Harinder Singh and Jasleen, I'd love to talk about our lived experiences with this conversation. How have we in our personal lives engaged in conversations around sexuality? So I'll throw to Harinder Singh first. I know before this webinar, we had a conversation a couple of days ago around moments where you've been asked to advise or had to engage in this conversation around Sikhi and sexuality in your real life. So in whatever form you're comfortable sharing, how did those conversations go? What did you maybe have to negotiate and confront in general when having these conversations?
Yeah, I think this is very real question. Thank you for asking that here. Look, you know, firstly, I want to say that I've had these conversations in Punjab as well as in the West. So sometimes people like to think that these Western Sikhs are somehow getting influenced by certain Western ideals and they are bringing all these things in there. There's no such thing. You know, there is at the time of the gurus, there was a East and West confrontation as well. And we addressed things as we best understood. And we learned those from the gurus and the way they talked about it. So for example, even in this discussion, you know, when Guru Sahib is saying, Aj na sutti kant seyo, ang mura mud jaye. So in Gurbani, when this is saying that, this is really intimate stuff, and we don't have katha on this. But the Gurus and the Bani is written that. Contributors have mentioned these things. And when ang muda mud jaye, and then jao pucho dohagani, tum kyun rehn vihai? So this level of, if the inquiry is serious enough, then we will be able to get into the Shabads. And that's what Bani is. Bani is inviting ideas into your consciousness so we can relate to the experiences of the contributors of Guru Granth Sahib. And if we are relating to them, then we will be able to have not just a civil conversation on this, but a conversation which is about developing our relationships. So I remember, you know, I can think of, other than being asked at forums about marriage and sexuality and homosexual marriages, and the people have been very uncomfortable. I remember sitting in a retreat in Seattle and being asked this question probably 15 years ago, and most people just looked at me like, what is he talking about? I'm like, well, that's what I know based on my understanding of Sikh ethos. And I remember having this conversation before I was married, sitting in a house in Chandigarh about, you know, and some of my associates telling me how to think about, because I had not experienced certain emotions or ideas of sexualities. So, you know, we go through our own phases of development. Before marriage, you know, we all get kicked with hormones. And I remember when I got kicked with those, I had to think about some of these things. And when I read Gurbani, then it started making sense to me. For the moment's pleasure, what am I really after? You know, I've had people coming from very traditional camps, including in Delhi, and asking me, is it okay to have a pleasure with your hand? You know, a boy asking this. And I think those are real questions. We need to understand they happen. People are engaged in them and they want to learn about them. So as I am learning about these things, as I was learning about these things, as I go through those sort of intricacies of and many a time you don't know what it is. Some of them are very raw things. Some of them require, as Gurbani said, I think, so this is where Gurbani really comes into play when it says, ete ras sarir ke kya gat brahm nivas. When I have so many pleasures, do I even have a room left to have a pleasure of the divine? So I think those are the real conflicts, real conversations. I like to believe everyone has a need to understand this because gurus and the contributors and the Bhagats address these. I think we need to take a more delicate approach to these, and we need to ask people to pause much more and share their feelings and ideas rather than this is it. Because there is not much this is it. There is a transcendence of this is it, which is what Ekankar itself is.
Yeah, I thank you for sharing with us. I think this report also, does delve with the real conversations that are happening in Sikh communities. And this report also has surveyed over 1,200 Sikhs worldwide. And it was clear from these responses that lust and sex are not synonymous, sex and sexuality are not synonymous. And there's also a clear consensus that Sikh institutions must play some role, and I see in providing non-judgmental support and resources to Sikhs of all gender identities and sexual orientations. And I do see some conversation and some questions regarding this. And I think the purpose of the report is to provide context, like we've been saying, on sexuality. And from my understanding, I don't think this report is arguing what the Sikh stance on sexuality is, but rather it's helping to, again, facilitate a conversation that people in the community may want to engage with. But yeah, this role that the institutions play is very real. And I do see already like 2 or 3 questions around this. So Jasleen, I'm gonna throw this last question of mine to you. What are the steps that institutions can take, if any, in acknowledging the lived realities of our communities?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think first off, we need to make sure that the institutions that are taking the lead on these things are they have a pulse on like what the conversations are. Because if all we're doing is sticking to what we think is tradition or what we think is right, because that's the way it's always been, what we think needs to be relegated to the private sphere rather than the public sphere. Like if we're just sticking to doing it the way we've always done it, while conversations are happening all around us where, there are so many queer Sikhs who are doing such brilliant and difficult work of like bringing these conversations into the public sphere. And if we're ignoring it, if institutions are ignoring it and kind of staying stuck in a specific time where that wasn't a thing that we talked about publicly, like maybe even a decade ago, then we're not really doing right by our smaller Sanghats and not doing right by the community at large, because part of what we came to as like a recommendation at the end of the report was that like they have to play, like institutions must like play some role in fostering environments that are non-judgmental, in fostering environments of support, in fostering environments where people can feel comfortable talking about these things without like fear of shame or judgment or like somebody calling their parents and telling them that they've, embarrassed the whole family. Like these are important things because it's not just about like a moment where someone feels comfortable. It's about how we move forward through time as a community in addressing all of the ways that this manifests, all the ways this conversation manifests, and the ways that when we don't provide support, it can cause harm. So I think that's really important. I think like if conversations on like sexuality and queerness are happening, which they are, institutions need to figure out how to sort of responsibly involve themselves in those things and speak to the people who are having those conversations and see what you can do together, because there are people doing that work. It's just not usually in sort of traditional institutional spaces.
If I may jump on this, I think I want to bring the people's perspective into this. And within the reports, the survey section, just the 2 contrasting things, for example, people at large, 1,200 plus of them globally, were very clearly able to distinguish between love and lust, as you heard earlier. At the same time, they were also telling us that they are not comfortable talking about sexuality in Sikh settings. And so that's the opportunity. The opportunity is what Jasleen was referring to is, and as Sikhi as institution, we also changed our mindset on this for this report. We are like, and we asked this in each report we put, but in this specific one, we said, well, do we have reviewers who are from those communities? Because if we only ask the people to review these things and give us inputs who only follow a particular lifestyle or particular tradition or particular ideology, then how are we learning and accommodating more to communities? We don't have to agree with each other necessarily on each of the personal choices of lifestyle or ideologies, but this inclusion of understanding that perspective at institutional level is essential. And I will give a personal anecdote here. Like, I have been asked to intervene in where an individual wanted to have a homosexual marriage. And for our traditional families, it is very, very hard to accept that, and you can understand all the pains which everyone goes through, not just that individual. And the idea is, then how do you have those conversations? Institutions need to learn to do that. Those who want to be solving the pains of people, definitely. And I'm not a trained individual, but people ask, and sometimes you have to say, okay, what you're able to do. So institutions need to develop those capacities, and I know our institutions don't have many capacities, but those who are choosing to, just like there are marriages of one kind, there are marriages of other kind. Just like there are lifestyles of one kind, there are lifestyles of other kind. And I'll just double down on what Jasleen said. And they all play a role in their own capacities to empower the Panth. And this is very important to understand. There are many who otherwise follow the letter of the law, what we call Rahit and Sikh Rahit Maryadas of their own persuasions. But they are involved in all sorts of things, or even if not, negative things. But even if they're not even contributing positively for whatever reasons. But then there are others who might not adhere to the letter of the law, yet or otherwise, but they are incredible contributors to the developments of Sikh community globally, as well as what's happening in Punjab even today. So we must become a little bit more accepting of that, realizing all of us are hypocrite, only Guru is perfect. And our hypocrisies, we can tone down. In our imperfections, we can tone down certain rhetoric to allow for this coexistence and co-development.
Yeah, I think so. Moving into questions that are coming in from our attendees, and building off of this comment that you've made on Rahit. Of course, this is, a common question that's coming up, and Amrit Kaur has wonderfully laid out her question, where she asks, there are many Sikhs who feel they have a right to make judgments using the discerning intellect to decide what is moral and what is immoral. It is often these individuals who feel qualified to comment on Rahit. So yes, how can our collective Rahit Maryada be created or changed, and can it be, to be more inclusive if we don't feel qualified to make these moral judgments ourselves? And I'll let either of you pick that up.
Jasleen, would you like to add?
I think you can take it on this one.
Sure. I mean, and firstly, this is a question which comes up on anything, when anything is Rahit related. Let me say it is not just about sexuality or marriages. So we must understand what code is. Rahit actually is a lifestyle. We have Sikh Rahit Maryada, and before that we had Rahit Names. And specific to sexuality, what we really need to understand is, and I alluded to this earlier, that the codes are always based on principles. So whatever we are adhering to right now in Sikh Rahit Maryada is an articulation which was best available 100 years ago in that cultural reality where they were interpreting Gurbani and history and the Rahatname. So we must understand that's how code works. So when they did that, they left a room towards the end and how this needs to continue. Our problem is we don't continue with anything. We, in fact, halt things very quickly and move on to other things. So people are like, even in this report, we pointed this out just to make it very real that the word gaman got, codified into not actually referring to explicit sexuality or conjugation. It just is, they made it something else. So Sikh Maryada, the first elementary step is, I think we need, and somebody wrote to me, and I remember 10 years ago we had this discussion, even 20 years ago, I even started a draft on it. We actually need a non-individualistic translation because we are missing out many things, even technically. Second thing we need is, in the absence of any accountability and how to make this system of codifications change, we need to have institutions who rise up to this. We need to have individuals who are putting out proposals. So I would be interested in creating a 2020 version of the Sikh Rahat Maryada. And the elementary step will be, so first let's actually do the translations and then create highlights on, what are the amendments necessary? And before those amendments, what are the conversations which are not as akin to the times we are living in, the realities we are living in. It's very clear to anyone who studies Sikhi that there are only 2 or 3 foundational things we cannot change in Rahat. Everything else we must understand is a code, and code has to be relevant. So we must have those conversations. I think if we have enough papers coming out on it, if we have conversations in a academic sense as well as in a community sense on it, and then we will be able to. I actually think it is not just the thinkers, because the question was from a thinker's angle. I think it's thinkers and practitioners have to come together to understand and feel Sikhi, and then they need to understand how to adhere to the Sikh principles and the ethos, and at the same time they have to exhibit patience, empathy, and dialogue so they can delve deeper into interpreting Sikhi for the current codes now. Just like it has taken us, the codes have 5 centuries of journey, 552 now. And those have navigated through, as I alluded to earlier, through caste, through remarriage. Look, even remarriage, how much socially, although it's so clear in the code, even socially, it's not a practice. It takes a long time to change a practice, and it's even very hard to change a practice if people don't remember the principles, which is what we're dealing with on the caste and the remarriage and those issues. Now we're dealing with something where we haven't even discussed. So just like a caste and the remarriage and polygamy and the race issues haven't been fully dealt with, although they have been covered by the Rahat, our work is really cut out. So our work really is to at least have conversations. It will take time. Our institutions are morally bankrupt. Our institutions don't have accountabilities, all the way to the ones who were in charge of taking care of these things. In the context of Punjab and India, it is no secret. Everyone knows we are not able to create those changes. So in the absence of that, let's have conversations, let's write papers, let's come up with what it needs to be. And if we are prepared, when the Panth is ready to come together to deal with larger issues, this will be one of the issues we deal with.
Mm-hmm. I think, it's an important point to hone in on, the lengthy process, just the process in general. I appreciate the nuance to this conversation, and maybe speaking more about the relationship between the academic and the community and the thinker and the practitioner, and how those should or can work together. We do have a question specifically for Jasleen, coming from Gundeep S. From New York. They ask, since you work at the intersections of academia and Sikh organization, and you can clarify if that's true or not, how can we bridge the knowledge we gain from those 2 institutions without being harassed by the Sangat for bringing Western knowledge into the Panth? I know it's a weighty question, but I believe it.
Okay, thank you. I don't know if I have a concrete answer on that. I think that I'll take it to what I think is a thing that I've noticed. And I'm not saying that this is the only problem, but I think something I've thought a lot about is our discomfort with and we've said this when in the context of the State of the Panth report, right? We have this discomfort with lack of concrete pronouncements. We have such a discomfort with it, and I don't think that's a uniquely sort of Sikh problem within our community. I think that's a human thing. We tend to be afraid of having to sort of take the things in front of us and think through things and maybe not always end up with something that is clear, which is not to say that there aren't clear moral pronouncements about certain things, right? Like within this report, we talk about if you engage in incest or if you engage in sex with a minor, you will face consequences. Those are old retname, right? So it's not that we're just floating with no sense of like a moral compass, but if we're going to say like Bani is timeless through context, through time, then we have to understand that interpretations will change over time, applications will change over time, and we have to get comfortable with that if we really want to have these discussions. And I think when it comes to like the academic and the like community, I think we need more work that focuses on like religious ethnography, which is why I have been thinking a lot about it. I think I am increasingly, again, personal, but I'm increasingly like uninterested in only looking at sort of stagnant texts and stagnant ideas. I'm very interested in how we personally connect. I'm very interested in how we live Sikhi. I'm very interested in what questions we're grappling with as a community. Because if we're only focusing on like academic interpretations, which like ethnography is a thing that happens in the academic world as well, but you're bringing a community into it, which again, can be a scary thing when we feel threatened by certain questions even, right? I think when it comes to academia in general, your job is to like be curious, and your job is to have a question and run with that question. And it's not always to have a concrete answer at the end of it. And if we're still at a stage where we are absolutely uncomfortable with even a question, then that tells me that we have a lot of work to do in bridging that gap. I don't have an answer, but I think like those are things that I've noticed as I kind of sit in the in-between of those two worlds sometimes. And part of what we try to do with the State of the Panth, like I know it's long and I know it's detailed, but that's part of what we're trying to do, right? Is like bridge that gap. We're not trying to use like certain academic buzzwords. We're not trying to speak a certain way where things are inaccessible. We're taking questions that we know the community is asking. We're surveying the community, and we're trying to intertwine those things so that we can think through these things together. Not just, think through them by ourselves or struggle with them by ourselves and then feel like the writings on them that academics have done are too inaccessible. Even when we quoted Kaur Singh's article, I said, we were talking about it, I remember, and I was like, this is so dense. It's so difficult to understand. He wrote a very long time ago, and he was an intellectual. And so we had to figure out a way to weave that into the language of the report so that most people could understand it, so that it wasn't this like dense thing that, you read and then you're like, I have no idea what that says. I don't know if that answers the question, but again, I don't know if I'm equipped to fully answer the question, if that makes sense.
Definitely. And even if that question is fully answerable to whoever it is asking, but I think you did a great job. I think so. Because it is called a State of the Panth report, we do have a question that asks you do have survey results from over 1,200 self-identified Sikh respondents, but how far is it correct to present it as a State of the Panth? So if you want to comment on that, Jasleen or Harinder.
Yeah. I can start, and then you can add if you'd like. I think this is a thing that we talked about with the last report as well, which was on abortion. And it's a valid concern, right? And we're pretty, I think we're pretty open about like methodology and the understanding that like we can't access, let's say like Sikhs who don't have access to internet. We can't get the survey to them, or older Sikhs, right? Like the demographic that is filling out the survey is very specific because of various factors. And I think that that's a thing that needs to be acknowledged. And for that reason, I don't think we've ever made the claim that like this is what the Panth is saying. That's the be all end all. But based on our survey, this is what we've got. This is what we're seeing as like the concerns that people have, or the thoughts people are having. And it could very well be that like a lot of people who don't have access to the survey maybe have different opinions. And I think what we try to do within the report is address those nuances before we even present the survey. The survey comes at the end. And the survey does not actually dictate what we are going to be talking about in the report, like what subsections we have, what questions we're addressing. If we have the survey results in and we see a theme and we're like, oh, well, this is a big theme that we weren't expecting, or this is something surprising, we weave that in. But it's not that the survey comes and then we're like, well, we have to write about this because these 1,200 Sikhs said that this is what they're concerned about. But no, that's a valid question, and something we think about a lot with every report.
Mm-hmm. Harinder Singh, would you like to add anything to that?
Sure, I'll build on that. So I think from this is where we at Sikhi, what we're trying to do, including through this report, is building a bridge between community and academia. So how do you take what academia has gotten very good at in terms of methodologies and systems and do work which is accessible and meaningful for the community so it does not remain in ivory towers? So survey is one such thing. Survey, we are being comprehensive in the ways we can be, like most of the surveys. I mean, we don't do Twitter survey. It's a thought out. We have a data analyst who looks at all these things, and that's what she did her master's in, So this is not what Harinder feels like or Jasleen feels like is what I'm trying to say. This really is, let's try to think out from an angle of what really needs to be asked and covered. And then let's reach the populations where the larger Sikh populations are. And there are norms of how do you present data. So we are completely open about it, not just demographics, but their geographies as well. And we are making the raw data available. And hopefully, this will allow people to go to large. I mean, 1,200 person survey is a big survey. Most of the polls you look at in election years, and all of those, they don't even have 1,000 people surveys, just so you know. So the point is, it is not that we are saying this is incredible survey. What we are saying is, this is the minimum we need to be doing. These are the minimum standards we need to have, which suggest to us, which show to us what a segment of the Sikh population is thinking and what they are grappling with, so we are able to address it to some level.
Yeah, I think it's nice to even know that of the conversations that are happening internally, that you are trying to make it more accessible, because academia, as you mentioned, the ivory tower, it can be very difficult to read some of those dense texts, but it does feel very, good to be able to understand a dense academic work. Shifting the conversation, there are a couple of questions around Akal Takht. So they're from various locations in the diasporas. This is clearly a conversation or a question that many are interested in tackling, and I know it is briefly mentioned in the report. So there's a question around the edict banning same-sex marriage, and then just to have more of a concrete question, Harpreet from the Bay Area in California asks, there was a conversation about bringing the topic of gay marriage to Akal Takht to have a final judgment. This seems dangerous, but my question is this something that could realistically happen? Yes, Surinder Singh, I'll throw this one to you.
So, thanks for asking these questions. I think we already know the answer. When the system is broken, when SGPC and its Jathedar are either elected or appointed by one political party who has little or less to no credibility, when we know Jathedars are appointed and removed at will of even one individual many a time, when we know the realities they are operating in are the Indian laws and the larger Indian understandings of these things, and I'm saying Indian purposefully because that's where the statutory bodies exist, we know that cannot be the only way to get there until our systems are independent. And in the case specifically of um, marriage and homosexuality and who can do lama or not, if the guidance is not coming from Bani and historical precedents, whether it involves sexuality, lust, or love, or marriages, and it also is not involving, we like to say critical thinking, but there is a Gurbani word. What is a Gurbani word? It says, ਤੁਹਾਡੀ ਸੁਰਤ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਆਉਣਾ ਚਾਹੀਦਾ. So there is a deciphering which has to happen. Vivek Dan, we ask for in Ardas. So if the pronouncements are being done with zero consultancies, if the pronouncements or judgments and directives are being issued which do not exhibit what the Bani and the history says, in the absence of all that, I think each individual has to ask, because we are told that by governments too. So I'm not going to tell you what to do. The cities we live in, the countries we live in, there are so many laws getting passed and we have issues with them. So every citizen has to decide what to do. There are some who choose to actively fight it. There's some who create just a Twitter war on it. There are some who work with people who are in the positions to change those things. Each individual needs to answer it to themselves. All we are saying is recognize even the context of what Jathedars are saying and recognize their the lack of sort of processes available to them. And it's not about the Jathedar himself right now, but it is about the office of Jathedar and Akal Takht Sahib and the SGPCs. And same thing applies to the local Gurdwaras. That's why they don't know how to deal with it. So individual Gurdwaras and institutions have to develop this system. And when enough, even if 5 to 10 institutions did this, now you have preparedness to deal with it in a larger community and something that can be offered. We are facing these issues with the Sarbat Khalsas and representation. So this is a subset of that. We are facing the same issues and the conflicts within the case of marriages as well.
So I do have another question for you, Harinder Singh. And Jasleen, if you want to jump in as well, that is more than welcome. But Sylvia from Italy asks, you discussed polygamy among gurus. How about polyandry, which I know is discussed in the report? As for example, it was widely practiced among Jats as Garewa. Is there any sanction / justification for it in the scriptures? And Sylvia, also asked about the location of certain verses that we mentioned. And I would just point her to the State of the Panth report, which has been linked in the chat. But yes, Harinder Singh, on the question around polyandry and
sure.
Jats.
So we touched upon that in the report. So, like I was saying, there are issues of polygamy, and I was trying to provide a context for it, that the percentage population which might be dealing with it, which we know is not very large. Similarly, when polyandry and other associated sexualities, there is no way we can cover exhaustive list, but we try to cover that in the survey questions. So like with anything else, I think this needs to be located in the context of what are the principles, like Bani's ideas. Even today's Hukum from Darbar Sahib, and let me actually make it very it says, eventually, if you are looking for eternal happiness, sada sukh, like something which you want to have forever, that only comes from sache sabad vichari. It will only come from once we contemplate on the wisdom within the words. And this is what we are going after, whether it is same-sex, polygamy, polyandry, or other things. You know what the culture says, you know what the law says, we know what is not available in the code, we know what is available in the code. Consider all this and you have a compass to work with. And that's what we are after. We cannot cover every single kind of sexual practice which is out there. But the purposes of these reports and creating these recommendations is to at least cover where the larger population what's dealing with, the larger conflicts which exist, and others need to be dealt with in a more microscopic way with more studies.
Thank you. There is also some questions around Anand Garage and interracial relationships. So we will take one of them. Shelly from Chicago asks, and I know the two of you are both based in the United States, so not that this is just a conversation that's starting now, but I think in the current context, Shelley asks, how are you having conversations in your community about interracial relationships and marriages, specifically with Black partners? Yeah, I'd also love some insight into that conversation. Jasleen or Harinder, whoever wants to pick that up.
Well, I guess I can start because I think my contribution will be quite short. I don't know of any conversations happening around me about that. I know that, I mean, I can share like personally within my family that all of my Masi's marriages are interracial marriages, and that's, you know, something that we as a family have always been quite comfortable with, and I kind of credit that sort of diverse family background for a lot of my sort of trajectory on my own Sikhi journey. So I think I would say that, like, if we're going to talk about like specifically like interracial relationships or marriages with specifically Black partners, I think we also have to address like anti-Blackness in the community, which is, you know, something that's come up recently. And I think it's good that that's now something that we're talking about more openly, because, you know, there's all, and I think we actually even maybe touched on this in the Anandgarj report of like what certain things people are okay with when it comes to like interfaith or interracial, and it's like, oh well, we're okay with this, but we're not okay with this, and we pick and choose based on our own like biases and things. So do I know of anything, or am I taking part of any discussions like that right now? No, especially not in the comfort of my home during this pandemic. But I am seeing those conversations happen like online, especially in the wake of like the revolution, like the Black Lives Matter protests and the murders of so many Black Americans that we've watched in horror throughout this year. So I do think it's important to have those conversations, and I think they are happening in the ways that they can. I would encourage more of it for sure. Harinder Singh, do you have anything to add?
So in the context of what we are discussing, I think let's do a couple of reminders on principles, and those are very important. So as we have covered this in Sexuality report a bit, and we covered this in the Anand report, intercaste and interracial marriages are a non-issue when it comes to Sikhi, which means it does not matter, you know, what their background is from those perspectives. Interfaith marriages are an issue and they need to be understood. And this is where I think we sometimes intermix the two things. What my friend, I have participated in marriages where they are interfaith marriages, but that doesn't mean there's a different thresholds. And this is where the Sikh world is grappling with. The ones who are officiating what's their thing, and ones who are going through this, do they understand what this is? So if somebody is to whatever level of practiceness it is, if they are coming together for civil or other purposes, or even social purposes in a marriage, it is their prerogative. But do realize that principally there are issues when they're interfaith marriages. That said, what I also want to acknowledge is most of the Sikh world has primarily grappled with this when Sikhs married Hindus traditionally. And in some cases where the interfaith marriage gave rise, traditionally speaking, historically speaking, to interesting sort of developments where who became Sikh and who didn't become a Sikh. In most cases, in a male-centric society, they joined, but some willful, like I know in my current family, where this had happened, where individual chose to become a Sikh, which means it is not an interfaith marriage then. So I want to say traditionally that's where it was. I know there is a big distance content, and I'm aware of at least two cases where there were divorcees who could not get married. They wanted to get married to a Sikh, and they were both non-Sikhs who embraced Sikhi in their life, and then they went back. So there is this dilemma, which is a serious one, which our community, when something is a non-issue, this is what I'm getting at. When things are a non-issue, even then the practice is not visible. So which means our principles are not understood at a level of behavior transformations. Now, we do know I personally am not aware of individual where one of the spouse is African American or Black Americans, if one prefers not to use US-based vocabulary. But those realities are happening. Those realities are being discussed now. And I know within my own families, and I have heard this in the conversation and the workshop I ran in London as well, we have created our own criterias around this, which is what Jasleen was referring to. They're not really Sikhi-based criterias, because I've heard people say, well, this is okay, but not Muslim. Well, this is okay, but not a black. Well, this is okay, but not you fill in the blank, right? So all I'm saying is those conversations do need to happen from a principal angle. They are happening right now, but most of them are not coming together from a perspective of behavioral change. They're still at a very, at best, intellect that, okay, we are okay with it. Well, if you're okay with it, then why is that not a visible reality? And that's where we are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, that's an important distinction to make. So I'm just going to acknowledge that there's about 5 minutes left. So I will, we'll do maybe 1 or 2 more questions. And if there's any closing remarks that the panelists would like to make, I'm happy to hold space for that. But there is a question around sex work, which Jasleen, I know you briefly touched upon. So Amarpreet asks, so it's a 2-part question. What would be Sikhi's thoughts on legalizing sex work? Western research advocates that it would create more safety for the people who engage in this work. And then there's also individuals who choose sex work as an occupation. So any thoughts on how this choice would be framed in Sikhi?
I guess my gut is telling me that if we're going to take the example of Ganika and say this was her occupation, was there some level of choice in it? I don't know if we can even really say anything about that. I don't think we can say anything about that conclusively. I think even something I referenced when we were talking about that was, even in certain contexts now, there's not always such clear lines of choice there's not such clear lines or ideas of choice, because there's all these different things that factor into people choosing that work. I know I use the word choosing, but bear with me. So I think if I'm coming from that perspective, reflecting on the verses that we included about Ganika, I would say that and reflecting on the conversations we're having about what are the realities, right? What are the realities of the world we live in? The realities of the world we live in are that people are doing this work. There are sex workers. And so I guess my understanding of the Bani that we talked about, and that perspective about sort of understanding the context of our lived realities and trying to address those in a way that doesn't fight the reality that exists. My gut would say, why wouldn't you want to make that as safe as possible for people? I know that that's not a thing that all of us are going to agree on, which is why I'm speaking in such a halted way. I think that's where I would leave it with that, is that rather than saying we're going to make it illegal because we're making a moral judgment, or we're going to make it illegal because we think that that's safer, we know that studies have shown that it actually makes sex work much less safe. And we also know that sex workers are often the target of violence. And then there's the added element of what about transgender sex workers who are already targets of violence, even if that's not what they do for a living. So we have to take all those things into account, and the lived reality and the statistics surrounding that work and the people who engage in that work. My gut from those examples and the conversation today is to say it would be kind of our responsibility as a society to make sure that if people are engaging in that work, which they are, to keep them safe. Harinder Singh?
Well, I think there are at least 2 things we can say with somewhat of a confidence based on our discoveries in the report. And then third is what Jasleen was referring to, where we have to exercise compassion and look at the realities. So 2 things which are very clear from the report is there cannot be any moral judgments on people who are sex workers. They will be, and they were always available to experience the culture of Naam as well. So I think that should really be driving the conversation, because that's the ultimate idea in Sikhi, that Bani is for all times, for all peoples, for all eras. So if it is possible, and I will bring the earlier question into there, which we didn't touch earlier, but we also reference this idea of Panchali, who was Draupadi, who in Gurbani is recognized, which refers to the multiple partners as well, right? This idea of that they all have access to this culture of creating this union or wedding with the divine. So that's the number one thing to remember in the context of sexuality. Second thing which we can deduce from the report is when it came to the practice of this among Sikhs, there were no denouncements done to prostitutions, but there was consequences mentioned to those who claim to be Khalsa, then why they must not engage in those activities. So going to a prostitute for a Khalsa, for one who's openly committed and initiated, who comes from the larger tent of Sikhi, they must, because this speaks to the personal sexuality then. Why are you doing that? Have you thought about your love, your calm, your sexuality? So that's the second deduction we can do, that individuals who claim to be or working towards this oneness must not go and be engaged in the with sex workers in the sense of for their sexual pleasures, because they are temporary pleasures. I know there are exceptions, but that's how the practice of prostitution or courtesans, because that's another thing I want to bring in. The word prostitute and sex worker are very fixed. In the South Asian context, they were very fluid. There were people who just danced. There were people who just sang. There were people who did playfulness. There were people who did anything more than that as well. And there are different words for all these. I just want you to know the context of the codification when it's coming into the report as well. And knowing those two things, the third thing will be, given that from a Sikh ethos and from a Sikh paradigm, you create the best conditions for people. We know human trafficking is a problem too. We know sexual slavery is a problem. And we know from our mindsets and the laws how we need to deal with this. So similarly, when the community is telling you something, a sexual worker community is telling you something, when the laws are informing of something, we should be using the ideas of Gurbani to facilitate that as well in order to enhance those lives or create safety for those lives.
Thank you. I think, yes, sorry, just to be mindful of time, and there's a question that's kind of beautifully linked to our webinar next week on the Guru Granth Sahib project. I will end with this question, and then please, Harinder Singh, Jasleen, Kaur, any closing remarks you'd like to make, please do make them. But this last question is about the recently launched Guru Granth Sahib project. Are there specific efforts in the project to make gender egalitarian and gender inclusive translations? For example, breaking the masculine pronouns when referring to the transcendent. So I will throw this one to Jasleen. But yes, feel free to throw it to Harinder Singh instead.
I'll catch it and then throw it if that's okay. Yeah, I think, I know, not I think. Yes, that's a conversation we have constantly. This is a global project, and so we have team members from all over, from varying contexts, of varying ages, and so we've even now, after this project has launched now, but it's something we've been working on for a while. A constant kind of thing that we come back to is like, what are the principles of our process? And sometimes we slip up. Like sometimes we have a he that sort of sneaks by us, and we have to go back and fix it. And I think like that is an understanding we have all come to as a team, like from the beginning, which is that using words like he or Lord, where they're not explicitly there, like there's the husband divine metaphor, right? But where that gendering is not there, there is no need to insert it. And in fact, it is an alienating move to insert those things into the text, into the translations. And then when it comes to the literal translations in situations where we have that dynamic between the human bride and the divine husband, right? we keep it literal. We keep it gendered in the literal, of course, because we have to honor that metaphor. But when we go into the interpretive and into the commentaries, we are very clear that this is about a larger relationship between a seeker of any gender identification, and the spouse, which is Ekonkar. So I think that is a thing that we do consciously come back to in conversation a lot of the time. Yeah, Harinder, saying anything to add?
Again, in this context, of course, what Jasleen just said, let me add a layer of that to it, including on the pronoun question and Guru Granth Sahib project and sexuality we are discussing. Remember, every contributor of Guru Granth Sahib is a male. So, and those male contributors in many shabads portray themselves as females. So when they're using those pronouns, including the sa and so, we just had a discussion in the Guru Granth Sahib project about this. There are many pronouns, by the way. There are more than 50 pronouns we're having to deal with this. So we're having to understand literally what it is, then the positioning of that and the metaphor which is being used. And on top of that, when the individual contributors, gurus or the pagas or the parts, when they are presenting themselves as a woman, so we are having to figure out what is that pronoun doing. What we can very clearly say from all these learnings is that the larger issue, which is what we have tried to bring out through a report and this conversation, hopefully to benefit individuals, that these constructs are primarily for conversations. When it comes to developing relationships, they are irrelevant. In relationships, it's the intimacy. In relationship, it's the personal development. It's the transcendence of the binaries and things of that nature, what we have been saying. And to put it in words of Gurbani, Guru Tegh Bahadur Padsha, we mentioned this in the report as well, where he says, he talks about himself. You see, when we have to talk about tough things, we have to personalize it as well, even if I have not done those things. And he says, Papi hiya, main kaam basaye. So, this idea of sin and the idea of lust, he's like, am I the sinner? I am the sinner because I am the one with calm. So let's figure out how to deal with the calm rather than saying that person is sinner. So we're not talking about the legal issues and sexual misconducts here. This is about development. Remember, when people do those things which are morally, ethically, and legally not right, there is a way to deal with all that. That's not a discussion today. Our discussion is, how do I deal with my sexuality? How do I deal with, quote unquote, my idea of what a sin might be, not just a traditional idea of sin. This is about also not just a traditional idea of what a hell is, because Guru Sahib also says, hey kamang nark bisramang, that it is because of you lust, I am living a hellish life. So, contributors have completely disrupted these social constructs, and they have said, let's go inwards. Let's try to understand what it's doing within my mind, within my body, within my sexuality, and then make sense of it so it can have a healthier relationship with the divine as well as at a personal levels, at a human level.
Thank you. I think, that's a important, again, nuance or point to contextualize this report into. I would, like to I thank the both of you first for having this conversation with me. I think I really appreciated the questions that have been coming in. They've been very thoughtful. And I would like to open up some space if you'd like to make some closing remarks. Jasleen, Kaur, Harinder Singh, anything you'd like to add that maybe we've missed?
I think I'll just take it into a more general, since this is the first State of the Panth webinar we've ever done. I think, I'm not going to reiterate the recommendations. I think that, if you want to see them, they're there. Feel free to read. But I think the more general thing that I'd like us to think more about as a collective is how to foster uncomfortable conversations, how to sit in the discomfort of those conversations, and how to really make sure that every moment that we have the urge to kind of fall into othering or fall into moral pronouncements, and fall into name calling, if we're going to look at Sikh Twitter sometimes, that we revisit this idea of, if we're going to take it to the baseline, revisit Ekonkar, try to cultivate that personal relationship. That's our work every day. And when we do that, those conversations we have are better. What we learn from each other is, hits home a little more, and we can see things change. Individuals start to change, institutions start to change. And I think that's something that we can all agree on, is that we'd like to, move forward for the betterment of the Panth, I think we can agree on that. So yeah, I think that's like a general point that I wanted to make.
Well, and I'll just leave it with that, well, both of you, Manvinder and Jasleen, you are adding to this conversation, and through the report, we have tried to add more to the conversations. And in the case of sexuality, let's bring people who identified with other pronouns, just like the gurus and the contributors did, to add to these conversations. This is just something in the absence of a articulation. We just did an articulation, right? So just one offering, and we need to have more of these offerings where he, she, they, and other pronouns can come in, including from a figurative as well as literal as well as lived experiences, so we can actually have a much more meaningful understanding. And then comes a meaningful codification. Thank you.
Yeah, and I would just like to end this conversation with more thanks. I think it's being echoed in the chat as well. I really appreciate the sitting with discomfort and what maybe happens after you've sat in the discomfort. So to let everyone enjoy the rest of their Saturdays, I'll do my closing remarks. We do host, this will be a weekly webinar. Usually they are bi-weekly, but our next webinar is on October 10th, so next Saturday, on the Guru Granth Sahib project. So this project aims to make the Guru Granth Sahib accessible to English speakers globally via technology. So join us in conversation with the project's global lead researchers. You already know Harinder Singh and Jasleen Kaur, but we will also be joined by Jaswant Singh and Ishmeet Kaur, as we delve into how this idea came to fruition, the transcreation process, the challenges, and how these translations will differ from other current translations. And lastly, don't forget to tune into the Sikhcast, a podcast produced by Sikhi, where we explore the various issues and events affecting Sikhs worldwide. Thank you for joining in. Today's webinar will be ending now. Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh.